Hi there, this is Zero Cynic again. I'm trying to see if I can get this video in before the workday starts. It's pretty early here in the morning, but something I was just thinking about. There's some music playing in the background. Hopefully it's not coming through too loud to disrupt this video, or the sound quality at least coming from me. I know you guys see me always holding this microphone, but I do so because I don't want to have it rubbing against the shirt because it causes some distortion, or my coat here. And I tend to hold it like this so you can hear me loud and clear, so you don't have to jack up your volume at home to try to hear what I am saying. Anyway, switching a little bit from my videos on Black Hebrew Israelites, even though they can check in and listen in on this one, and they can see some relevance to what I'm going to be talking about. Today I want to talk about something or someone I have known about for quite some time now. I would like to say, I can go out on a limb right now and say that most people have never heard of him, have no clue. And yet, for so many people in this world, especially on this side of the world, we owe so much of our religious tradition or beliefs on him. So basically, it's something to think about and something to ponder. At the end of the day, oh my God, I hate using that cliche, that line. But at the end, it may have no effect on you whatsoever. But it's worth knowing because it puts so much into perspective. I'm not going to mention his name right as yet, but I'll get around to it after I give this background. We're going to go back to the Bible again, and we're going to go back to not just the Bible, but history, which somewhat includes the Bible, not the other way around, basically. When people pick up the old Jewish Old Testament or the Old Testament, I'm sure without thinking, most people just follow the, I'm sorry about that, follow the usual mantra that it is the inspired word of God. It was written by holy men, different men over X amount of centuries, and it all came together to make this one beautiful, in complete harmony type of book. Collection of books come together to be one, telling one supreme truth, one ultimate truth, one ultimate story, and so forth. There are others who extend into the New Testament and say it's the same thing there, and it's just a collection of 66 books that's just the Word of God. Well, there's a lot of people out there that know that's not even true, and that's the wrong approach to take when it comes to reading the Bible. This is what the fact really is. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded the kingdom of Judah, which we would call modern-day Israel today, or at least the southern portion of it. Prior to that, he had come before that, and he carted off the elite, the cream of the crop, the princes, the royal family, and so forth. When he came back in 586 BC, he exiled a bigger chunk of the population, but again, it was still the cream of the crop. It made sense. You want to make sure you cut off the head, so to speak. Get rid of the royalty, get rid of the more educated folks, those who could benefit your kingdom, those who could benefit the upward mobility of your kingdom. Those are the people that he mostly took. I'm not saying he didn't take anyone else from the regular population, but the people who were taken away were the nobility, the kings, the princes, the royal court, and so forth, and taken to Babylon. These exiled Jews were there in Babylon for about a good 50 years or so. Now, during that time, or I should say eventually, the Persians came on the scene, led by Cyrus the Great, one of my favorite kings of all time, of the ancient world. Cyrus comes in and he eventually conquers Babylon, takes over Babylon, and the Persian Empire was the new empire on the scene. During this time, Cyrus, who is known to be one of the most benevolent kings in human history, he was not stupid and he was not foolish. So what he basically did was he eventually allowed the Jews, because the Jews were there during the Babylonians, they hated the Babylonians. For as far as they know, the Babylonians came and destroyed their civilization, took them away from their livelihood, and then humiliated them by carrying them off as captives to Babylon. When Cyrus took over, Cyrus and the Persians took over, Cyrus took another approach. His approach was he noticed that some of these Jews yearned for their homeland. They wanted to go back to where they came from. Cyrus, using some psychology and knowing how to get around with certain things, because he patronized other people's gods, so to speak, their supreme beings. So he allowed, with his blessing, his financial support, he allowed a certain amount of Jews to head back. Whoever wanted to go back to their homeland could go. These groups were led by, one group was led by a Jew by the name of Nehemiah, and another group was led by Ezra. Now, not all of the Jews returned back home to their homeland. Many of them stayed in Babylon. A whole new generation had grown up over there. That's what they knew. And Babylon was like the New York City of that day. It was like the mecca of all the excitement, learning, business, trade. So a lot of the younger generation, maybe even some of the older ones who've gotten accustomed to over there, didn't feel like heading back to a torn down place, wrecked, destroyed. Because the mission of these Jews going back to Israel was to go back to try to rebuild their city, rebuild their civilization, and not all of them were in for that. Some of them stayed in Babylon. And we come to find out that Jews in Babylon just had a thriving community that went on for quite a few centuries. As a matter of fact, when we get over into the New Testament, we read about one of the epistles of Peter, I think it is, where he sends some salutations to the church in Babylon. Okay? So Babylon didn't just drop off the face of the earth. It remained as a very prominent place and a prominent city during the time of the Persians also. Anyway, Cyrus allowed these Jews to go back home. And they went back home and did their thing, and a lot of Jews ended up staying in Babylon and going to other places around the Persian Empire. Now, here's something I want you to think about and consider. Whenever you look at Jewish history, or whenever you read in the Bible or whatever, but let's go with Jewish history. The Jews were dominated by a few empires, notably the Babylonians, and then the Persians, followed by the Greeks, followed by the Romans. Here is something that you may not have noticed, but out of those four empires that I just mentioned, the one empire that you never read a bad thing about in any Jewish literature are the Persians, is the Persian Empire. You can read in the book of Psalms where they talk about their hatred of the Babylonians, even wishing that the enemies of the Babylonians would come in and take Babylonian babies and crush their heads against stones. That was their sense of revenge coming out. Because look at what the Babylonians did to us. Let the same thing happen to them. Let their children be taken and smashed against stones. There was no love lost between the Jews and the Babylonians. Then we get to the Greeks. And the Greeks came in with their Hellenism and this foreign way of life and philosophies and so forth. And the Jews rebelled against it in open rebellion, which became known as the Maccabean Revolt. They hated the Jews to the point where they hated the Greeks to the point where one of the Greek leaders by the name of Antiochus in anger because he was defeated down in Egypt, and he felt the Jews had a lot to do with his defeat. On his way back to his kingdom in Syria, he stopped off in Jerusalem and just took out his frustration on the Jews. He went into their temple and sacrificed pigs and threw up some image of himself or some statue of some god in the temple court or the inner sanctum of the temple, which just was just utter blasphemy to the Jews. And they eventually revolted, and it was known as the Maccabean Revolt. So they hated the Greeks. Then came the Romans, who were welcome initially because they got rid of the hated Greeks. But eventually, the love was lost real fast, especially after the Romans set up a puppet king like Herod, who was not even a Jew. He was an Idumean, more or less a neighboring group of people next to Israel that were hated. And the Romans basically set him up as a puppet king over them. That did not endear the Romans to the Jews at all. But the one group, or the one empire, that we don't read anything bad about are the Persians. And the Persians actually were around, at least their first empire, their dominant empire, which was known as the, I think that might be the Archmain Empire. I'm not sure. I could be wrong about that. It lasted for about, 200 years? And on that time, believe it or not, the Jews actually flourished, rose in parts of government. They flourished. They flourished under the Persians. And you do not read one bad thing. Look as hard as you may. Try to find somewhere where you find the Jews saying anything bad about the Persians. What you do find in the Bible is a man like Cyrus. He is lauded with praises from the writers of the Bible. He's called the Messiah. They look to him like the deliverer, the man who delivered them from the hands of the Babylonians. He is seen as someone who was ordained by God to do a work to deliver the Jewish people. And then Cyrus went as far to finance a movement back to Israel for these Jews who want to go back. Gave them money so they could rebuild their temple walls, their city walls, and so forth. This was Cyrus. And then we read in the book of Daniel, which was a much later book, probably written sometime during the Greeks. No, it wasn't written, way back in Babylon, anything like that. Could have had some basis in something that happened in Babylon, but it was written much later on. But when we read the book of Daniel, we read where the Persian king is so fond of Daniel, but because he is held to Persian law, he had to do what he had to do. But you can just tell the fondness he had for a person like Daniel. We read about in the book of Esther, and we read about how the king Artaxerxes, I think that's who it was, I think that's his Greek name, Esther's husband, how he helped to, I guess you can say, deliver or help out the Jews from the hands of a man who wanted to use Persian law against the Jews to get rid of them. So again, we read all of these wonderful things about the Persians in Jewish literature that you don't read about when it comes to the Babylonians, the Greeks, and the Romans. And it was during this era of goodwill between the Persians and the Jews flourishing, is when many scholars believe that the Jewish Old Testament was written, or at least finished, or edited. May have started during the Babylonian captivity, the actual exile, but it looks like it was completed sometime around that time, and perhaps maybe over into the Greek times. And because of all this peaceful, amicable relationship between the two groups, this was also a time when a lot of Persian thought, Persians being the dominant force, their religious thoughts eventually crossed over into what well, put it this way, crossed over into what we would say is Jewish thought, Jewish theology, which was not too complex. And eventually, Judaism, that eventually ends up in the New Testament, that we see in the New Testament, was formulated during this time of goodwill between the Persians and the Jews. Now, up to this point, some of you may be like, what in the world is this guy talking about? I don't see any such thing. What a lot of Christians don't know, and a lot of people may not be aware of, is the fact that between the book of Malachi and the book of Matthew, let's just say between those books, there was about 400 years that rolled by, and a lot of action took place during that time. Now, let me go back a little bit. And I said I was going to mention the name of someone. Persian religion was known as Zoroastrianism, coming from or named after a influential religious figure who was Persian, and his name was Zoroaster. And I think I'm giving the Greek version of his name, Zoroaster. Zoroaster lived, the date of his birth is still somewhat ambiguous, or the year or whatever, but somewhere between 1500 to maybe even as far as 3,000 years before the time of Jesus, or at least what's in the Bible, is when he lived. And he came up with a revolutionary thought, or thoughts. And it was basically, he looked on and realized that the world had a lot of bad things and it had some good things. And he realized that the only way you can get rid of evil is to try to influence people in terms of how they looked at the world. You do good deeds, you think good thoughts, and you always choose good over evil. This was his teaching. Now, we don't exactly know where this may have come from, if it started out with him or it was later developments in the religion that he founded. But there was a belief that the earth, or human history, you had your good and your bad, and they were controlled by two different sides. But he believed, and he was more or less the original believer in a monotheistic concept. Now, of course, there may have been other people in the ancient world, like down in Egypt and so forth, with Akhenaten, who may have also taught this. But Zoroaster believed that there was one supreme deity, and his name was Ahura Mazda. One supreme deity. But below him, or I guess you can say with him, there was also an opposing side, led by someone known as Angra Mainyu, if I'm saying this correctly, if I'm remembering correctly. This other force represented all things evil and all things dark, whereby Ahura Mazda was the father of light, the father of truth, the father of all good things. And Zoroaster, or the teachings in Zoroastrianism, is that a man had a choice where he could live on the side of good, truth, purity, light, or live on the side of evil. He also came up with this thought about the afterlife and the immortality of the soul. These were the things that he taught. So, basically put, you live your life, you live what is right and true and noble. And once you die, you will go to a place known as paradise, which happens to be an Iranian word, a Persian word. Paradise, which means enclosed garden. It's not a Christian word. It's not a Jewish word. And this is where you would go to enjoy eternal bliss, because your soul will live on. Now just think about it, the influence this will have on people. Now in Jewish thought, prior to meeting or encountering the Persians, Jews just believed that you live this life and you try to do whatever you had to do in this life, because once you died, it was all over. So you try to get it all in this life, because once you died, that was it. And you went to this shadowy place known as Sheol, and that was basically the end of it. You just walked around just aimless. The bad people were there, And the good people were there. There wasn't any separation between the two. You just wandered around. Your rewards for doing good was in your life now, not in an afterlife. But just think about the lack of incentive that provides. Hey, I can do whatever the hell I want to do in this life. I can be bad, I can steal from other people, I can do whatever I want to do because when I die, I just die. End of story. In Zoroastrianism, that was not the case. It was as if karma, so to speak, followed you even beyond the grave. You want to live a wicked life? You want to live a bad life? You want to hurt people? You want to do wrong things? Well, in the next life, you don't just die. You continue to live on. And your deeds and your works will be judged. And there will be punishment or reward based on the type of life you live right now. These type of thoughts eventually crossed over into Jewish thought because remember, the Persians were the dominant force. They were the imposing force. The Jews were just a few people in this great empire. And some of them were influenced by these Persian thinking. And it was a step up in their theology. It was like, hey, this is good. This is complex. This makes us feel better that if this guy over here is treating me bad and whatever is going on, he's doing all these wicked things. You know what? He's not going to get away with it. He might get away with it in this life, but in the next life, I'm going to be living in paradise. I'm going to be I might be poor. I might be going through pain right now, but if I just do the right things, over in the next life, I'll be just okay. Whereby that wicked guy over there, he's going to get what he's coming to him. So I don't have to worry about it. He will be taken care of in the afterlife. Now, how do we know that some of these things crept over other than that? Here is an example. The Jewish holy men, or in the southern part of today's Iran, or somewhere in Iran I think it is, or the Persian holy men were known, or the language to this very day, I think it's still called Farsi. Farsi. I think some people spell it with a PH. And I think they were also known as the Farsis. And I think they were from a region in Iran known as Farsi. Or in ancient Persia known as Farsi. The language is still called Farsi to this very day. Now, remember those 400 years I talked about where it seems like nothing happened because no one seems to know much about it, but 400 years went by? During that time, when the Jews rebelled against the Greeks, in the Maccabean revolt, they eventually established their own dynasty, their own kingdom, called the Hasmonean kingdom. But prior to that, when they were fighting against the Greeks, a new group of radical, want to stay to the law, want to follow the law with all their hearts, rose up. These were the forerunners of what became known as the Pharisees that we read about in the New Testament. Now, if you think about it, you read the Old Testament, you will never read anything about the Pharisees or the Sadducees or the scribes and the Sanhedrin. You won't read about that. But you open up your New Testament, all of a sudden, they're there. You read Malachi and you open up to Matthew and you start reading about these groups called the Pharisees. And it's like, okay, where did they come from? Well, if you really think about it, now, some people have made this connection. It may or may not be there. I tend to think it's there, and I'll explain to you why. This group that were the forerunners of the Pharisees, they became these religious, how should I put it, like zealots, sticking to the law, to the point where they ran into problems with their own kings, the Hasmonean kings. And the reason why, they believe that the Messiah or anyone who was going to sit up on the throne over Israel had to come from the tribe of Judah. The Hasmonean dynasty came from the tribe of Ephraim. So they had a problem with that right off the bat. So they never really respected the Hasmonean kings and the Hasmonean rulers who were Israelites, but just not from the correct tribe, sitting up on the throne. So, of course, there was civil war and there was war going on and so forth. Anyway, by the time we get to the New Testament, we read about this group known as the Pharisees, and these were the people of the law. But there's something that you need to pay careful attention to. One day, this group came up to Jesus in the New Testament. And as they came up to him, the writer carefully says, I guess in parentheses, that they came to question Jesus. And the question was, hey, Jesus, if a man dies and leaves his wife behind, and she marries someone else, his brother or whoever it is, when they all die and they go over into the next life, whose wife would she be? But one of the things that the writer puts into parentheses to describe this group known as the Pharisees, he said, these were the ones that believed in the afterlife or in the resurrection. Why do you think he mentions that? Because it goes to show you that the Pharisees were known for that belief. Where did they get that belief from? Where did these Pharisees get this belief from? Remember, they were a group of people hundreds of years before that who had an influence in Jewish thought, and they were known as the Pharisees. And the Pharisees became known for that signature belief, that they believe in the afterlife. Why? Because other groups in Israel, in Judea, did not believe in such a thing. Their rival group was known as the Sadducees, who were more the aristocracy, who held more to the older, ancient Jewish beliefs, not believing in all that afterlife nonsense. You died, that was the end of it. You try to just make it here, gain all your wealth, gain your fortune in this life. Whereby the Pharisees had this newfangled thing that, yeah, in the afterlife, this is what's going to happen to you. And you tend to read that stuff in the New Testament, where you find there's a lot of talk about the afterlife, heaven, paradise. So when you're sitting there thinking that your belief is unique, or that there's some reveal or revelation, please understand that the Bible was not written in a vacuum. And get rid of that thought that it was written, God spoke down to... No, it wasn't anything like that. The Jews were small, basically insignificant group in that region. The Babylonians dominated, the Assyrians dominated, the Egyptians dominated. The Persians came and dominated, the Romans, the Greeks. The Jews just went from hand to hand. But they were influenced by these dominant religions. They were influenced by, the New Testament was influenced by Greek philosophies and Greek mystery religions. So you always had that group of Jews who always thought that these new religions were coming, these new empires are coming in and trying to influence them and trying to change their way of life. And this is why some of them rebelled. And this is why there was always rebellion. It didn't mean that you didn't have Jews who went along with the current thought. But the thing about it, the Jews rebelled against the Greeks. And they went after some of their own people for following Greek ways. How dare you follow that Greek paganism? They did the same thing with the Romans. You had Jews who walked about the hillsides known as Sakari, the men of the daggers, who killed their own Jewish people who they thought were sympathetic to Rome. Now, I don't know what happened with Babylon. That was a little bit different. But in Persia and with the Persians, you hear of no such thing. You hear of no such thing whatsoever. So again, there's this amicable relationship with the Persians. And during this time, the Jews thrived. And during this time, there was an exchanging of ideas back and forth. And when Alexander the Great conquered after the Persians, when he brought down the Persian Empire, at least the first incarnation of it, when he brought it down, the way he set up his kingdom, ideas moved all the way from the Punjab in Pakistan, across Iran, Persia, all the way over to Europe, and down the Levant, down into Egypt. Trade, commerce, and ideas went across this route. And so the Jews were influenced by all of these empires, and all this thinking and thoughts crossed over into Jewish thinking and into their religion. So today, if you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Rastafarian, if whatever you may be, you may want to thank a Persian, and you may want to thank Zoroaster for the beliefs that you hold today. I'll talk some more about this, but it looks like my video might be up soon. Thank you for joining in. Thank you for listening. Subscribe, like, and this is your Cyril Cynic. Have a good day.